Hi, I'm Lori Valone, Pack Leader at Doggone Good Consulting. Together with Suki, Loki, and Isaac, we bring you Doggone Basics, a series of short videos to help you learn about Power Platform or simply refresh your memory on selected topics as you work with Power Platform. Right now we're focusing on some of the essential background skills that you need to have to be able to work with either Power Apps or Power Automate. So tonight's topic will be understanding data types. Data types are critical to being able to successfully work with both Power Automate and Power Apps. Probably the number one error that I got in the early days of working with Power Apps was an invalid type error because I didn't have the proper data type, or I didn't understand what was going to be returned within a particular control, and so I was trying to test for the wrong type of value. And once I figured that out, things got a whole lot smoother. So we're going to run through the data types today that you will use in Canvas apps. Again, my focus is on Canvas apps because that's what I do every day for work. So what I'm going to cover today is going to be specific to Canvas apps. Also understand that Power Apps, which is where this obviously this focus is going to automatically map from whatever your actual data source is into the data types that Power Apps uses. So the data type that you might save, say, in SharePoint may be slightly different from the internal data type that Power Apps is going to use. But Power Apps knows through the connectors what the translation or the handoff needs to be between data source and the Canvas app. So we'll focus on how does Power Apps see those data types. So let's dive in. This is a list of all of the data types that are used in Canvas apps. There are some here, frankly, that I have never used. I don't use option set, and I haven't used toOption. Option set is used more frequently with CDS, I believe. Not to say that you can't use it here, I just haven't had a need to use it here. So I'm not going to dwell on those. GUID I have used, although I'm using it less. I used to use GUID to supply a unique value to my title fields, but I've actually started to simply eliminate the title field as a required element in my applications in SharePoint. And so because of that, I don't have to supply a value, which means I don't need to stuff a GUID in. Now, there could be some time when I need to use a GUID as a unique value, but most of the time I'm relying on the ID number, and my actual key value is something in the meat of the data rather than a GUID. So you can access the GUID very simply. There's a function that's simply GUID open parentheses, close parentheses, which will generate a unique GUID if you need one. But I have not been needing it near as often as I used to. I want to talk a little bit about, really briefly actually, about record and table and record reference. Because we talked about records and tables in the first Doggone Basics video. If you haven't seen that, go check that one out. It goes through in detail about columns, records, and tables. But these are probably, tables in particular, are probably one of the ones that will give you the most problem with your invalid type errors, like I was mentioning. We'll talk about some of the commonly used data types. The ones in blue here are the ones that probably I use 90% of the time. So let's talk about records, tables, and record reference for a minute. So probably, as I started to say a minute ago, the biggest problem I had is I was looking for a particular column, but the reference I made was to a table rather than the individual column within that table. And that will generate an invalid type. With the new debugging tool, that's how I refer to it anyway, that's available to be able to look into a number of your fields and tables easily in Power Apps, it's a lot easier to determine if that's what you're doing. And so I've had less of those errors, plus just plain experience. The longer you do this, the less likely you're going to run into problems. Records and tables are both compound data types. They're a data type, but they're made up of other data types. So a record is going to have a bunch of columns. Each one of those columns is going to have a data type. And collectively, when brought together, they represent a record, and that record is in and of itself a data type. Then again, you'll have a collection of records that makes the table. Table is a data type, but the records within it are a data type. So you see what I mean about being compound data types. Now the record reference is a little different. Record reference points to a specific record and lets you use it without necessarily having to say the whole thing every time. So for example, when you select something in a gallery, the application knows which record you had selected, which one was your active record. So you can refer to the fields in that record that you're referring to with this item dot and the name of the particular column that you're looking for. Similarly, you can refer to the first record in a table or a collection by using filter first and the name of the data source. These are both examples of record references, and you'll use these a lot as you work with your data sources, and they'll become more and more fluent. I don't even consciously think of record reference as a data type so much. It's just kind of, to me, it's kind of a thing you do to access the record in the table, but it actually is a data type. Okay, enough about records and tables for right now. Let's move on and talk about some of the most commonly used individual unique data types. Boolean is probably the one that if you are not used to doing any kind of application development, is probably the most foreign to you. Boolean is just a fancy name for a true-false variable. It's used very often for as a control mechanism, to use it in some type of an if test. When you save in SharePoint, if you have a yes and no field, the values are really true-false values. The example here, for example, I'm filling out a text field, a reservation field actually, to say whether or not reservations are accepted, and that's based on the value of the Boolean field reservations. And you'll notice that has a record reference in it, just like we were talking about a moment ago. So I'm testing to see if this item dot reservations, so if the value in this item dot reservations, and you'll notice I don't have an equals there. Booleans in Canvas apps are unique in that you can, if the value that you're testing for is true, you don't have to say equals true. You can just simply say if Boolean field name. So in this case, if this item dot reservations. And you can also test for false by saying exclamation mark, which is shorthand for not. So if exclamation mark this item dot reservations would say if it's false. Okay, so it's just a quick shorthand notation that works just with Booleans. It's the only thing you can do that with. So in this case, the way the if statement is constructed, the first piece in the parentheses is what's your test. The second piece is what do you do if the test is true, and the third piece is what do you do if your test is false. Notice that that is not that the variable is true or false, the field that you're testing, the actual this item dot reservations is true or false, but the test you're making. So in this case, I'm saying if this item dot reservations is true. I don't have to explicitly say is true. It's automatically implied by the fact I just said the name of the field. So if this item.reservations is true, then put the literal yes. Otherwise, if that is not true, then put the literal no. Okay, so that's we'll talk about that a lot more when we get down into control structures in a future video. All right, so that's the Boolean. I use Booleans a lot. They're indicators. I might use them in an if statement, in a switch statement. I use them to control whether or not something is visible or colors. There's all kinds of things you're going to do with Booleans. So they are a very good friend, so get familiar with them. All right, speaking of color, color is actually a data type. Again, this is one of those ones I don't necessarily consciously think of as being a data type, but it actually is. And there's 3 different ways you can refer to data types. Hang on a second. I got somebody here who wants to come help me out. This is Suki. Say hello to all the people, Suki. Color. There are 3 different possible ways to set it. You can use the very simplistic approach, which is simply to say color dot and a color name, and I forgot exactly how many there are, but there's a bunch of color names, and there's some really unique ones there. It's not just red, green, blue, but cornflower blue and steel gray, and there's a whole long list you can use. So if you're just needing to do basic colors and differentiate, just saying color dot and a color name is probably all you really need to do. But if you need to represent, say, corporate colors, okay, I need to use an exact color to be able to match my company's brand. And so in my case, I might want to use something like color value, and then give it the hexadecimal representation for a particular color. 394951 is a kind of a dark slate gray that my company uses. Additionally, I can also use the RGB code. Okay, and you'll notice it's an RGBA code. The A is and I don't remember the exact meaning of A. RGB is red, green, blue. I think A is alpha. But what it really means is it's how opaque or transparent is that color. So in effect, it lightens or darkens the color. At 1, a value of 1, it's going to be the full intensity of that color, full darkness. At 0, it's going to be, you're not going to see it at all. So 0.81 is a fairly dark but not super dark version of the color represented by 137, 12, 135. Okay. And you notice in this case, in the case of the RGB code, we're using it with a fill field. So I'm filling in the background on a block. The color that's the other 2 examples are from is used to set font color. So both of these were pulled out of an application. All right, moving on. Let's talk about DateTime, DateTime, and DateTime. Okay, 3 different things, 3 different data types. Just depends on what you need. If all you need is date, then just use a date field. If all you need is time, just use a time field. Sometimes you need both. If you need effectively a timestamp when something occurs, then you need date time. I find for most of the things I'm doing, date is sufficient, because I'm usually working with what day did this occur. I'm not doing things so finite. But if you're working in a manufacturing application or something where you're customer service, where you're recording times of calls, quite likely you will need date time. I'm not sure that there's all that many instances you might just need time, other than if you're calculating, time between 2 intervals, something of that nature. Most of the time you're putting it in terms of, a a time forward from a particular date and time, in the business applications anyway. I'm sure that there are other applications that just time is needed. The things that I do, I have found date normally to be sufficient or date time to be the most appropriate. You have the ability to control your time zone. You can choose between local time or UTC time. That can be very important. If you have a global company, you may need to use UTC so that you have a common base for everyone to refer against. So just something to consider. All right, image. Well, there's Suki again. Image are brought into an application by way of a Uniform Resource Identifier, or URI. And that provides the location where you can go get the image from. So in the case of my image of Suki here, taken from my website, this is the location inside my web hosting platform in which I develop my web page that the images are stored, and this is the specific image. Suki hard at work on my computer and not looking at all thrilled with me at the moment. But this string of characters, it looks very much like a URL. Actually, a URL is a form of a URI, is how you will specify images. Now, you actually in Power Apps, it becomes easier in that you can upload them through the either media viewing media or through directly as you add an image to your application. And once it's uploaded, then you can specify the one you want to use, and then Power Apps is internally assigning this string of location, going back and saying where in the media library is that stored and what's the file name. So it's being done internally for you in the case of an application. Media is I guess a specialized version of this. Audio or video is actually contained in the media data type. Image is a form of media, and if you're working in Power Apps, you will see them all listed under media. But from a data type perspective, image is separate from media. And you'll see here is a URL, which is a URI, for where my recent tips and tricks video is located, which is a video file. Numbers. Depending on your app, you may have a whole lot of numbers. I have a few in my apps. I use a lot more text than I probably do numbers, but numbers are stored as floating point values. Currency is actually also a data type. It is a special data type that has all the characteristics of a number, but it also provides the ability to format the information as currency. I actually have not had a reason to use the currency data type. Everything I've done so far, I've been able to do with the number data type, but that is available to you if you're dealing with things that are in currency and you need those currency formatting options. Text. Text is where probably 98% of the stuff I do is. Text is actually a Unicode character string, which is a value in a basic language of characters that specifies, depending on what language, a unique value for every single symbol, number, character in all the different languages. So there is a Unicode character for Chinese letters and Japanese letters and Arabic letters and everything else that you can think of. The example here is for an English letter, capital A is U plus 0041. Okay. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with the Unicode. We just get to deal with the actual character string. Character strings, text strings are normally in quotes. You'll get errors from Power Apps if you forget to put your quotes in when you should, or you get too many quotes. Once you get the hang of those, you won't have near as many of those. Or if you get one, you'll notice very quickly that that's the source of your issue. Text fields are generally in an app stored in labels, so they might be in a text input field, they could be in a drop down or a combo box. There's lots of different ways that text is represented. It's typically human readable, although sometimes in a global company some of that readable text, because it's Unicode, might be in another language and I may not be able to read it without some form of translation. That covers all the data types that are commonly used in Power App Canvas apps. If you want to go deeper on data types, there is a good Microsoft article on data types that I recommend, and there is also a good article on record references that you might find useful if you want to understand a little more deeply the concept of record references. Both of those you'll get very familiar with as soon as you start working with apps, and with just a little bit of practice, they'll all feel very, very familiar to you. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll join us for another episode of Doggone Basics.